Welcome back to Shattered Trust Stories. It was a typical evening, or so John thought. He had come home from work as usual, exhausted from the grind, but eager to relax in the comfort of his home. But something felt off. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Mary, his wife, wasn't in the living room where she usually was, watching TV, reading, or working on something. Instead, there was an unsettling stillness in the air. John dropped his keys on the entryway table and walked through the house, calling out for her. "Mary?" he asked, his voice tentative. No response. A slight sense of unease crept over him as he made his way upstairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet house. When he pushed open the door to their bedroom, there she was, sitting on the edge of the bed, her back to him. She was perfectly still, almost as if she was waiting for him to notice her. But as John took a step closer, he noticed something strange in her posture. She didn't look up when he entered the room. "Hey," he said, walking closer. "Is everything okay?" Mary turned to face him, her expression unreadable. There was something in her eyes, a coldness, a distance that he hadn't seen before. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm but firm. John's heart skipped a beat. He had seen that look before, the one that signaled a serious conversation. He sat down beside her, his mind racing with 100 different possibilities. Had something happened? Was she unhappy? What was going on? But he didn't ask. He didn't want to make things worse by jumping to conclusions. "Okay," he said slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's on your mind?" Mary paused for a long moment, and John could feel the tension hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. Finally, she spoke. "I'm not going to be intimate with you anymore," she said flatly, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. The words hung in the air, lingering between them like a dark cloud. John's breath caught in his throat. He blinked, not sure if he'd heard her correctly. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the sudden rush of disbelief and confusion flooding his mind. "What do you mean?" he managed to say, his voice low and shaking. "What are you talking about?" Mary's gaze didn't falter. "I don't want to be with you like that anymore, John," she said, her tone colder now, more distant. "I just can't. It's not something I'm interested in." John sat frozen, struggling to comprehend the words she had just said. It was as if the floor had been ripped out from under him. All the years they had spent together, the passion they had shared, it was all gone in an instant. A part of him couldn't believe it. A part of him wanted to deny it, to pretend that this was just some sick joke. But Mary's face, her expression, told him everything he needed to know. This was real. This was happening. The silence in the room was suffocating. John didn't know what to say, how to respond. The woman he loved, the woman he had shared everything with, was telling him that she no longer wanted him in that way. It didn't make sense. Why? What had changed? What had happened? "I don't understand," John finally managed, his voice breaking. "What happened? We've been fine, haven't we? We've been happy." He said it as though repeating the words could make them true. Mary stood up, moving toward the window. "We haven't been happy, John," she said quietly, her back to him. "I've been unhappy for a long time now. But I didn't know how to tell you. And I didn't know what to do. So I just kept pretending." John felt a wave of nausea hit him. Pretending? She had been pretending? For how long? The questions flooded his mind, but he didn't ask them. The pain was already too much to bear. "I don't know what to say," he whispered, feeling the weight of the words press down on him. I thought we were okay." Mary turned to face him, her expression softening for a brief moment. "I know you did, John. But I've been feeling like this for a while. I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I don't feel the same way I used to. John's mind spun, and his thoughts collided in a chaotic frenzy. What did this mean for their marriage? How could things have changed so drastically? And most importantly, what was he supposed to do now? But then, as if something inside him snapped, a thought suddenly struck him. What if he stopped pretending too? He had always been the one to accommodate her needs, to bend over backward to make her happy. He had always been the one to fight for their marriage, to give her what she wanted. But now, in this moment, the dynamic had shifted. It wasn't just about what she wanted anymore. What about him? What did he want? The thought settled into his mind like a stone sinking into water. He didn't have to keep fighting for her affection, for her love, if she no longer wanted it. If she no longer desired him, why should he keep giving everything for someone who had already decided they were done? I understand, he said, his voice calmer now, more resolute. The words were almost foreign to him as they left his lips. But once they were out, he couldn't take them back. Mary blinked, clearly taken aback by his response. You understand?" she asked, confusion flickering in her eyes. "I do," he said, standing up slowly. "But I'm done pretending too. If you don't want me, then I'm not going to keep helping you." Mary's face twisted in disbelief. "What does that mean? What are you going to do? Just give up?" John turned toward the door, his decision made. "No. I'm not giving up. I'm just done putting in all the effort when you're not willing to do the same. I'm not going to keep chasing after someone who's already decided they don't want me." Mary opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She seemed paralyzed by his response, as if she had expected him to beg, to plead for her to change her mind. But John wasn't going to do that. Not anymore. As John walked out of the bedroom, he could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. A part of him still didn't want to believe it. He didn't want to accept that his marriage, his life with Mary, had reached this point. But another part of him felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't the one scrambling to fix everything. He wasn't the one desperately trying to keep a relationship alive that seemed determined to wither on its own. As he lay in bed that night, his thoughts racing, one question remained: would Mary realize too late what she was losing? But even as he asked himself that question, John knew there was no going back. Things had changed, and now, he would have to face the consequences of those changes, whether he was ready or not. The next few days were a blur. John kept his distance. He went about his daily routine, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Mary, for her part, seemed to struggle with the shift in their relationship. She would attempt to engage him in conversation, only to be met with a coldness and distance that was now coming from both sides. John wasn't the only one who had changed. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table, staring into his cup of coffee, John heard the sound of Mary's footsteps approaching. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The change was palpable. The game had shifted, and now it was her turn to face the reality of her choices. "I don't know what to say, John," she began, her voice filled with frustration. "I never meant for things to end up like this." John didn't respond immediately. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee, then set the cup down gently. "Well, you've said everything you needed to say," he replied quietly. "And now, I'm going to do what's best for me." John's decision to stop helping Mary wasn't a sudden choice. It was something that had been brewing for weeks, maybe even months. His eyes had been opened to the reality of their marriage, and he was no longer willing to ignore the cracks beneath the surface. He had spent so much time trying to fix things that he had neglected his own needs, his own sense of self-worth. But that was over now. Days passed, and the house felt emptier than ever. Every time he walked through the front door, the silence hung like a thick fog. Mary was still there, of course. She was in the house, walking through the same rooms, but she was a stranger to him now. He had always been able to rely on her, to talk to her about anything. But that was no longer the case. The woman who once stood by him, who once shared everything with him, was now a shadow in his life, someone who had chosen to push him away. The shift was subtle at first, but it was undeniable. Mary tried to act as if everything was fine, but the cracks were showing. The warmth in her voice was gone. The touches that once came naturally were now absent. And yet, despite it all, John refused to take the bait. He refused to fall back into the role of the desperate husband, begging for affection. It wasn't easy. Every day, he had to fight the impulse to reach out to her, to ask her what had gone wrong, to try to salvage the pieces of their marriage. But he knew he couldn't go back to that place. Not when it was clear that Mary wasn't willing to meet him halfway. One evening, as John sat on the couch watching TV, the door creaked open. Mary walked in slowly, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of frustration and confusion. She had been trying to fix things, or at least pretending to. But it was clear now that the distance between them was growing wider with each passing day. "John," she said, her voice softer than it had been in days. "I need to know where we stand. This silence is killing me." John didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure how to answer. What was there to say? He had already made his decision. She had made hers, too. The intimacy they once shared was gone, replaced by cold formality. Their conversations had become nothing more than routine exchanges. They talked about the kids, the bills, the weather, but not about the things that really mattered. "Where do we stand?" John repeated, his voice calm but laced with underlying tension. "I'm not the one who's changed, Mary. You've pulled away. You've stopped caring. And I'm not going to keep pretending that it's okay." Mary looked at him, her face a mix of guilt and anger. She had expected him to react differently. She had expected him to chase after her, to beg her to stay. But that wasn't who he was anymore. "I'm not asking you to beg," Mary said, her voice trembling slightly. "I just want you to fight for us. I want you to show me that you still care." John stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He wanted to care. He wanted to fight. But the truth was, he was tired. He was tired of chasing someone who had already checked out. He was tired of being the only one who cared. "I have fought, Mary," he finally said, his voice steady but firm. "I've fought for this relationship for years. But right now, it's not just about me. It's about both of us. And you're not willing to meet me halfway. So, no. I'm not going to keep fighting if you've already given up." There was a long silence between them, one that stretched for what felt like an eternity. Mary stood there, frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected him to be so resolute. She hadn't expected him to stand his ground. For the first time in a long time, John felt like he was in control. The power dynamic in their relationship had shifted, and it wasn't because he was angry or vengeful. It was because he had finally realized that he deserved better. He deserved someone who would love him the way he loved them. He deserved someone who would fight for him, just as he had always fought for them. As the days went on, the tension in the house grew thicker. Every interaction felt like an ordeal. Mary would try to engage him in small talk, but he would respond with clipped, one-word answers. He wasn't interested in meaningless conversations. He wasn't interested in pretending like everything was fine. And the more he distanced himself, the more Mary seemed to struggle. One night, as they sat at the dinner table with their two kids, Mary tried once again to break the silence. She pushed her food around on her plate, avoiding eye contact. "John," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how you're done. And I don't know what to do. I never meant for it to get like this." John looked at her, his expression unreadable. The kids were talking, unaware of the tension that had settled over the table. Mary was vulnerable now, exposed in a way she hadn't been before. She was no longer the strong, confident woman who had stood by him all those years. Now, she was just a woman who had made a choice to pull away, and now she was left to face the consequences. "Mary," John said slowly, his voice steady. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what's happening now. You made a decision, and so did I. I'm not going to keep trying to fix something that you're not willing to fix with me." Her eyes welled up with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she stood up abruptly and walked out of the room. John didn't chase after her. He knew that this was a moment of reckoning for both of them. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to keep giving. He wasn't going to keep sacrificing his happiness just to hold on to a relationship that was already slipping through his fingers. Later that night, as John lay in bed, he stared at the ceiling, his thoughts racing. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He had stopped enabling Mary's emotional withdrawal. He had stopped pretending that everything would magically get better if he just kept trying harder. But now what? What was next for him? Could this marriage be saved? Or was it already too far gone? He wasn't sure, but as he closed his eyes, one thing became clear to him: he couldn't go back to who he was before. He couldn't go back to the man who would do anything to keep his wife happy. That man was gone. And in his place stood someone who knew his worth. Someone who would never again be the one begging for affection, for intimacy, for love. The following days were a mix of tension and uncertainty. Mary tried a few more times to talk to him, but John wasn't interested in rehashing the same conversation over and over again. He didn't need to explain himself. He had already made it clear where he stood, and yet, as much as he tried to keep his distance, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. What was happening to their marriage? Could they really go on living in this emotional limbo? Were they simply waiting for the inevitable, or was there still hope? As the days stretched into weeks, John found himself questioning everything. His life, his marriage, his future, nothing seemed certain anymore. And even though he was resolute in his decision, he couldn't help but wonder if the woman who had once been everything to him was truly gone forever.